Heavy rain one April night in 1956 caused a cable failure, giving the KGB the excuse it needed, turning the West's intelligence feat into a Soviet propaganda victory.
Obviously, there was a feeling of great unhappiness. On the other hand, you just sort of shrugged your shoulders and said, well, we were lucky it lasted that long.
5 years later, George Blake was himself betrayed and sentenced to 42 years in prison. He had given the KGB the names of nearly 400 agents working for the West, supposedly on condition that they wouldn't be harmed.
During my trial, which was held in camera, so everything could be said there was no mention at all, it wasn't part of the prosecution's case, that I had been responsible for the death of any number of agents.
But armed with Blake's names, Moscow simply waited until they had sufficient additional evidence.
George Blake had that innocent mind, in a sense. He is still a very naive man. And he didn't want to know that many people he betrayed were executed. And I think we even discussed this subject at one point, and he wouldn't believe it. He would say, well, I was told this would not happen. It did happen. He was not told.
As the Cold War intensified through the 1950s, pressure on the CIA increased. The West was desperate for detail about the size and strength of Soviet forces, glimpsed and photographed at Moscow air shows or May Day parades. It was the Soviet missile force which worried the CIA most and about which they knew the least.
There was limited human intelligence about missile deployments in the Soviet Union. There were some communications intelligence which would suggest that this facility or this town may be involved in missile activities because of communications with known missile sites. But what we were missing was any firm, hard evidence of actual deployment of missiles.
From 1956, American technical superiority started providing answers. The CIA's own reconnaissance plane, the U-2, flew high over Russia to photograph Soviet bases. But in 4 years of searching, found no operational intercontinental ballistic missile launch sites. Then in 1960, the Americans successfully launched a satellite fitted with a camera. After 17 orbits, the film capsule was ejected, caught mid-air, and brought back to Earth for analysis. A subsequent flight confirmed the existence of just one Soviet ICBM launch site. The rest of the puzzle's pieces were provided by perhaps the greatest spy of the Cold War.
This is a photograph of Oleg Penkovsky, colonel in the Red Army, with all of his medals which he earned during World War II. A handsome soldier and a great American patriot. This photograph was taken in a hotel in London in April 1961 after one of our meetings, where Oleg Penkovsky on the left, me on the right, enjoying a small glass of wine.
Penkovsky provided further reassurances about the limitations of Soviet power.
While they were still a serious threat, no question about it, they were strong militarily, absolutely strong militarily, but they were not as strong as our estimators had felt. And he helped us bring it down to the level where they really were. They were not 10 feet tall, they were about my size, 6'2".
Penkovsky revealed the Soviets' lack of atomic warheads and their problems with guidance systems. He acted out of resentment that his career in military intelligence had stalled, but also out of fear that Khrushchev's adventurism would bring disaster on the world. Khrushchev told Kennedy, "I want peace, but if you want war, that is your problem." But Penkovsky told the CIA that Khrushchev was bluffing. Kennedy should be firm, he said. Khrushchev is not going to fire any rockets. He is not ready for any war.
If you can get into the mind of the Khrushchevs of the world, then you've got a weapon that no technical amount of information can give you. And this is what Penkovsky was able to give us.
Penkovsky's information was critical to the United States during the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. U-2 photographs revealed the presence on Cuba of Soviet missiles, for which Penkovsky had already handed over the operating manuals. With the world closer to nuclear conflict than at any time in the Cold War, intelligence experts were summoned to the White House to brief President Kennedy.
First question the president asked was, how long before they can fire those missiles? And Art Landau said, well, Mr. Graybeal is the missile expert, so it turned to me. I stood up behind the president, McNamara and Rusk, and for the next probably 5 to 10 minutes, I fired one question after the other. In answer to the president's question, how long can they fire these missiles, I relied primarily on the combination of intelligence sources, but mainly Penkovsky's information, which told us how these missiles operated in the field.
The CIA assessment is said to have bought the president 3 precious days' breathing space. Ironically, Penkovsky himself was now under KGB surveillance. The last time Joe Bulick had seen him was in Paris.
I never had the feeling that he was in danger. Otherwise, I would have insisted that he stay. In fact, forced him if I had to kidnap him. But I never really had the feeling that he was, at that time, at our last meeting in Paris, I never felt that he was in danger.
Back in Moscow, Penkovsky sent what seemed like a routine message.
We'd gotten a signal from Penkovsky that a dead drop was loaded. And when we sent Dick Jacobs to service that dead drop, he was arrested. And as soon as that happened, we knew the case was over. He was dead. And then Penkovsky was in the hands of the KGB. Boom.
Расскажите о начале вашей преступной деятельности. В ноябре 1960 года я решил войти в контакт с американской разведкой, для чего я подготовил письмо, в котором высказал эту свою просьбу и желание начать со мной работу.
The chief KGB interrogator was Alexander Zagvozdin.
We questioned him not once, not 10 or 20 times, but perhaps 100 times. He realized that his actions were punishable by death. And he used to ask me, will I be executed? I never said he wouldn't. I never said he wouldn't be executed. I used to say one thing. Only if you confess everything and repent fully can you hope for mercy. That's probably why Penkovsky's life was not spared. He didn't confess everything. I know for sure that Penkovsky was shot. I can't tell you anything else. I know his body was cremated. I don't know any more, and I'm not interested.
Not all spies wound up famous. These are the home movies of Galina and Mikhail Fyodorov, KGB officers who operated under deep cover for 20 years. They were never caught. In the event of war, they would be in place to spy behind enemy lines. The KGB never lacked recruits. Some served for money, some for ideology, and some for the sheer excitement of living a secret life.
I love espionage. Why? Because there is the smell of adventure, the smell of risk, the smell of uncertainty. Because when you go off to meet an agent, you never know whether you're going to be arrested. It adds color to life.
I need 007.
No, Mr. Bond, I expect you to die.
Spy mania in London started about the time I arrived. In 1961, we used to be asked everywhere. We were very popular. We would be invited to private parties, and the attitude towards us was good. But as the 60s went on, there were those big disasters with Blake and the other KGB spies. And you had the Profumo scandal with the prostitute, Christine Keeler. That shook Britain up a bit. After that, when I turned up somewhere, people would ask, "Are you a spy?" So I'd say, "Of course I'm a spy."
Western governments grew weary of the huge KGB presence in their midst. In 1971, the British expelled 105 Soviet intelligence officers, identified by a defector. Technology increasingly assumed the burden of spying. Satellites could now intercept radio communications and data from test launches of the opposition's missiles. Film taken in space no longer even had to be returned to Earth.
The satellite would take the picture of the sky, and this image could be beamed back to an analyst at his desk in the United States who could actually see what was happening in the international arena without leaving his desk.
Here lay the greatest intelligence successes of the Cold War. Through photography and electronic eavesdropping, each side received huge flows of information, often too much for the analysts to handle. Technological spying even played a part in helping the superpowers edge towards peace.
The technical systems were almost essential to our arms control process. We learned just all kinds of things about Russian military systems from the photographs and from the electronic listening. At one point, when we were negotiating the SALT II arms control treaty, I had to go to the Senate and say, if you ratify this treaty, this is how closely I can monitor it and check on whether they are complying with the terms of the treaty.
Despite a fleet of spy ships, listening posts worldwide, and Sputniks overhead, Soviet technical intelligence lagged behind the West. Even so, they claimed to have cracked the ciphers of over 60 countries, obtaining many codes by theft and blackmail.
Soviet technical intelligence was far inferior to Soviet human intelligence. The Soviets were extremely good at persuasive tactics, which would ultimately bring many people into their ideological embrace.
KGB spying methods spread beyond superpower conflict. Routine surveillance of ordinary citizens by the East German secret police, or Stasi. The Stasi inhabited a moral world of its own. Interrogations were routinely filmed. And they had cameras everywhere.
Relations between the various areas of counterintelligence and with the department which handled interrogations were very amicable. There were all sorts of people there, and it was a friendly atmosphere.